Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Parliament sitting in Canberra, of course, and breaking news events coming out of Israel. We'll cover all of those tonight with Greg Sheridan. Labor and the Greens have come together to defeat a move by Jacinta Price to establish a royal commission into child sexual abuse in remote Indigenous communities. So no spending audit, no protecting the vulnerable, just more talk today of a treaty. Another big day in the Parliament, the PM dodging questions over his Makarrata Treaty Commission, despite Saturday's overwhelming rejection of race separatism. I'll be joined in the studio by the editor of The Spectator magazine in the UK for a wide-ranging discussion on the state of modern conservatism and what it takes for conservative leaders to win elections. And that day today, the shocking day in Gaza, hundreds killed in a hospital explosion. Hamas blamed Israel. But as the Israeli Defence Force have just confirmed moments ago, this was a jihadi rocket that misfired.
According to our intelligence, Hamas checked the reports, understood it was an Islamic Jihad rocket that had misfired and decided to launch a global media campaign to hide what really happened. They went as far as inflating the numbers of casualties. They understood with absolute certainty that it was a rocket misfired by Islamic Jihad.
There's also a lot of translated comment in and around Gaza that's been put to light tonight. I'll get to that, as I said, in a moment with Greg Sheridan. But first, when it comes to The Voice and its emphatic rejection, it's becoming clearer and clearer that the Prime Minister just doesn't get it. Now, a referendum's for keeps. It's so much more definitive than passing a law that might be changed or electing a government that will eventually be defeated. When the Australian people speak at a referendum, that's final. But today, for the fourth day running, the Prime Minister, as yet, still doesn't want to accept their decision.
Is it the Prime Minister's position that he doesn't know if he personally supports Makarrata Treaty and truth-telling until he speaks with the referendum working group?
And what we have campaigned for, I said very clearly, was to listen to First Australians about matters that affect them. Now, if those opposite think that we should not listen to Indigenous Australians about matters that affect them at all, then they should say so.
Spin and dodge. Listening to that, it's like Saturday never happened, but it did. Because while he still refuses to acknowledge the overwhelming result, Australians rejected his voice. They rejected treaties too that would carve up this country and spend billions in compensation. They rejected so-called truth-telling as well, because unlike the elites, they see our national story as one of resilience and pride, not one of shame. But what else staggers me in all this fallout from the referendum is this. For months and months and months, Anthony Albanese denied that a treaty was on the table. But here he is in the immediate aftermath of that crushing defeat of his voice, and now he refuses to take treaty off the table. Wasn't on the table before the vote, now he won't take it off the table. So no treaty last week, but nothing but treaty this week. Now, it might be funny if it wasn't so serious. It might be funny if this bloke wasn't our national leader. Over and over and over again, he said the referendum had nothing to do with treaty. He said the Uluru Statement was just a one-page poster, that the Voice was no more than a simple advisory committee.
Unexpected.
This isn't about a treaty, Ben.
But there are three parts of the Uluru Statement.
Yeah, and this is
so
not.
You're talking about the Voice.
This is not about a treaty.
But as part of treaty, which we guess will be a following step.
This is not about a treaty.
Do you foresee that compensation would be paid?
This is not about a treaty.
Yeah. There are three stages. So after we go through the Voice, is it natural to assume that as part of treaty?
No, it's not natural.
Now, he said that to Ben Fordham, even though his government had already put money in the budget, some $6 million to a Makarrata or Treaty Commission, another $20 million plus yet to come. But those denials aside, it was always about the Indigenous separatists trifecta. All of it. Voice, treaty and truth. And we know that now because after Saturday's loss, he's still pushing on with the Makarrata Treaty Commission that as late as last week before the voice went down, he was denying was part of the plan. Indeed, people like me who said it was, well, they were called conspiracy theorists by Albanese. Well, who's telling the truth now? Here's the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, on the ABC on Sunday.
We've made clear that we support the Uluru Statement from the heart, and that is a part of it. So the principled commitment to everything that's contained in there we have made and we don't move away from.
Here's the PM on Monday.
Is the Prime Minister committed to Makarrata truth-telling and treaty?
What I'm committed to post the referendum is respecting what Indigenous people have said. Now, the voice was, with constitutional recognition, was important. Makarrata is simply a Yolngu word for coming together after struggle. I think it's a good thing that people come together, and I made that very clear on Saturday night that that is my position.
Respecting Aboriginal people, but not the voters on Saturday. Here's the Prime Minister again on Tuesday.
Will the Prime Minister be honest and upfront with Australians and inform the House whether or not he remains committed to a treaty and truth-telling process?
What I have said very clearly is that I will give respect to Indigenous Australians who have asked for a week to consider their position. I think that is pretty reasonable.
And again today.
And what we have campaigned for, I said very clearly, was to listen to First Australians about matters that affect them.
Give them the week, give them respect, but not, it would seem, the rest of us. Here's his hapless Minister, Linda Burney, whose own electorate voted against the voice proposal.
Is the Minister still committed to treaty and truth-telling?
The request for a voice to Parliament came from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That's why we took it to a referendum. Of course, we respect the result and accept the decision of the Australian people. Our focus has always been on getting better results for Indigenous Australians. I think that's something that we all agree on.
Now, like her boss, Bernie too keeps just dodging questions on treaty. I mean, what don't these people understand about your vote on Saturday? Surely they must be able to read the numbers as well as we all can, because listening to them in the Parliament, it's as if the referendum never happened. And yet it would appear they're hell-bent on a Makarrata Treaty Commission, while at the same time, you heard her there about practical solutions, at the same time rejecting a Royal Commission into child sexual abuse in remote Indigenous communities.
We need action for those children in remote communities, our most marginalised, suffering sexual abuse, neglect and other abuse.
And like many of the interventions by those opposite, this is all about the politics and never about the solution. Always about the politics, never about the solution. What it's really about, an angry pursuit of the people that they don't like, who didn't agree with them in the recent referendum.
Mate, almost 2/3 of the country didn't agree with you. Labor too are refusing to back an audit into the spending of billions and billions of dollars the taxpayers put on the table, but that is not reaching people and closing the gap. Now, I can't think of anything more calculated to offend voters than this. Could well make this Albanese government a one-term government. It's just not right that a government can have a referendum and then try and ignore the result. But if the Albanese government persists with treaty and truth despite the weekend's vote, it will be a clear case of telling the Australian people that they don't really matter, that democracy doesn't matter. And if that's where we are, look overseas. That's about as dangerous a place as any for Australia to be in. All right, let's go to camera for all the other headlines. We're joined now by Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Good evening. The Greens are calling on the Albanese government to condemn Israel as well as Hamas over the Gaza conflict. Adam Band questioning whether Israel was involved in an attack on a Gazan hospital.
The Israeli military has already changed their story, firstly saying that, then saying it was Islamic Jihad, and that's been denied by Islamic Jihad. And I noticed that reporters are on the ground saying, well, you often hear this response from the Israeli military, but in any event, okay, there will, no doubt there will be further unfolding and information about that.
Israel denies responsibility and claims it was an own goal style attack. The Prime Minister indicating he does not want to see civilians killed on either side.
Every innocent life matters, whether it is Israeli or Palestinian. Our thoughts are with those killed, those injured and their loved ones. The protection of civilian lives must come first.
We believe that Israel has a right to defend itself. However, we have always called, from the beginning of this, I've called for the protection of human life and for restraint.
The Five Eyes intelligence chiefs have issued a scathing critique of China, accusing it of intellectual property theft on an unprecedented scale.
Chinese government is engaged in the most sustained, scaled and sophisticated theft of intellectual property and expertise in human history. It's unacceptable, it's unprecedented. Our discussions here will raise awareness of these threats and improve our collective defences.
ASIO Director-General Mike Burgess took the rare step of rebuking China as Prime Minister Anthony Albanese prepares to visit Beijing later this year in a bid to ease tensions between the two nations.
Do you believe the war in the Middle East, as well as Ukraine, increases the chances of China exploiting the situation in some way and potentially even edging closer to an invasion of Taiwan?
We can focus on more than one thing at one time. We're going to stand by our partners in Ukraine, we're going to stand by our partners in Israel, and we're going to protect our public and our economy against the generational threat that's posed by the Chinese Communist Party.
Our job is to continue to defend our nations for any nation that tries to exploit any situation anywhere, and we will just continue to do our job and do it well.
The Pentagon today also declassified footage of Chinese planes shooting flares near American jets. RBA Governor Michelle Bullock says she's concerned that the escalating conflict between Hamas and Israel could keep inflation higher for longer.
We've just got shock after shock after shock. Typically when we think about shocks to supply that increase prices, you'd think, well, that's probably okay, it'll wash out. But the more people adjust their inflation expectations, the more entrenched inflation is likely to become.
Volatility in oil markets has increased since Hamas attacked Israel on October 7. The warning follows the release of hawkish RBA minutes suggesting the central bank is committed to returning inflation to the 2 to 3% target range by late 2025, upping the chance of a rate hike next month.
All right, let's get across all of those headlines and more. Joining me now, the Daily Telegraph's National Affairs editor James Morrow and Herald Sun columnist Patrick Carline. Gents, welcome as always. A feature today, again, of Question Time. I've run the footage there, James Morrow, and that's the PM's continuing commitment to set up a Makarrata Treaty Commission. Now, I don't know what he doesn't understand about Saturday night's vote. It was a comprehensive loss. It's a trifecta. You don't get the second leg of the trifecta if you didn't get the first leg of the trifecta. He didn't get the voice. So why on earth are we going blindly down this path?
Well, I think, Peter, you highlight something that's very important here, which is that the left, not just Anthony Albanese, but an awful lot of other people who are very much on the yes side, they're engaged in something that they've always accused the right of, Trumpian election denial. They're looking at these results and they're saying, well, they don't matter. The people got it wrong. So therefore, we need to do something different here and just continue on our way because we're on the side of the angels. We're on the side of reform. We want that treaty. But as you've always said, that treaty, that national treaty, is the main game for all of the legal implications that flow from that.
I should have kept my racing analogy for Patrick Carline, the son of the great late Les Carline, a racing man and historian, as we know. But Patrick, you know, this push last night by Jacinta Price and others to get up a royal commission into what we know is occurring, but not necessarily the scale of it in remote Aboriginal communities, that failed last night. Labor won't back an audit into the spending either. This is what Australians actually want to see. They want to see practical change, don't they?
Well, absolutely. To borrow from the Yes campaign sort of rhetoric, they talked about truth-telling. How could you better tell the truth than to have a royal commission into this very serious problem in Indigenous communities? If you want to close the gap, and I think 60% of people voted no on the weekend. I think 98% of Australians want better outcomes for Indigenous communities. You've got to get into this truth-telling. You've got to explore the problems and understand the problems, whether it's education or employment or child abuse. This is a terribly backward step that actually throws to the whole empty, navel-gazing type rhetoric that the Yes campaign sort of fell into, especially in the last few weeks, whereas Jacinta Price is trying to throw forward, trying to make the future better.
Spot on, truth-telling about today, not truth-telling about 200 plus years ago. Hey, Jim Chalmers, this is interesting, James. Outside of parliamentary sittings, there's a whole lot of these international meetings that go on. I mean, the Prime Minister never misses an opportunity to head overseas. We know he's off to Washington next week. But Jim Chalmers, he missed a whole lot of, I think, really important economic meetings last week. G20 finance ministers, International Monetary Fund. Instead, he stayed home to campaign for The Voice. Now, given all the talk today from Michelle Bullock, the RBA may hike rates on Melbourne Cup Day, concern about high oil prices feeding into inflation. I reckon his time could have been better spent at the meetings as opposed to the failing Voice.
Well, absolutely. And, I was just looking before we went on air to see how Jim Chalmers did campaigning for The Voice. Well, certainly in his own seat of Rankin in Queensland, it went 65.3% no. So well done there, Treasurer. You really got him over the line in your own home electorate. But that said, we live in a time right now, Peter, where I think, as everybody, I don't tell anybody, cost of living is front of mind. Geopolitical shocks around the economy are coming, and they're going to keep on coming with the situation in the Middle East and elsewhere. The Treasurer needs to be plugged into what fellow finance ministers in the West are doing, are planning, are hearing, are anticipating, so that Australia can better absorb these shocks, manage them. And he should not have been wasting time campaigning on a Voice which, if all of the reports we've read are true, well, we know that 3-4 weeks ago at least, internally they knew the thing was not going anywhere.
Patrick, I want to go to what we're seeing play out in Europe. We've got a terror attack in Brussels. 2 Swedish nationals who were there have been killed. We've got concern, I think it was a Chechen in relation to killing of a French teacher last week. Calls today from ASIO that we need to be alive to spontaneous attacks here in Australia. I was working for the Prime Minister when Islamic State basically exploded in the Middle East. This was a huge concern of the government then. I suspect they're similarly as concerned now.
Well, they'd have to be, wouldn't they? I mean, I can't remember a more volatile time of uncertainty in my adult life, and especially today with those dreadful scenes at the Gaza hospital. Everyone's trying to blame one another. I thought it was interesting the ASIO boss talked about, he linked words and rhetoric to violence, and I think some of the things that have been coming out of Parliament in the last couple of days from the Greens are very inflammatory, potentially very dangerous. It is a really difficult time at the moment. The next few days will sort of sort out where it might go, but we might be dealing with this for months. The English historian Niall Ferguson talked about the unpleasant 1930s air that the world is facing at the moment. Now, he knows what he's talking about, Peter.
Look, I 100% agree with that. I actually have it in my notes later on for someone else I'm talking about, particularly the anti-Semitism. That absolutely feels like that to me. Hey, what's going on in Adelaide? The Lord Mayor wants the flags, or has put the flags, Indigenous flags, at half-mast, despite the fact that South Australians rejected The Voice. James?
Yeah, Yeah, well, again, this is part of that Trumpian election denial here. You know, they just simply cannot accept the results that they got. I find this absolutely unbelievable. I find it an offence to democracy. I think it's also an offence to the people of Adelaide and of South Australia, who overwhelmingly rejected this, not because they're bad people who are racists and don't want to see Aboriginal people succeed, just the opposite. And I think, you know, this whole stuck in the past mentality that we're seeing playing out with this great tantrum with the no vote, which I predicted, this tantrum of the elites. We'll be seeing it with the misinformation bill coming up soon and other sorts of measures. But, you know, this is just the first thin edge of this wedge.
They spotted Alan Joyce today in Ireland. I'd expect he would be in Ireland given his background, but that's where he is, overseas, not fronting the Senate inquiry here in Australia. There's talk that the Senate are going to vote to drag him back here. Patrick, should he front?
I think he has to, Peter. The big surprise today in that story revealing he was in Ireland is he's been there for weeks and weeks and weeks. He needs to be back in Australia, and he needs to be explaining some of those dreadful decisions that really had tainted the legacy that was built up for so long. That he was one of the wonderful sort of figures in being Australian and doing the right thing. Now that's all been turned on its head. He certainly has to answer questions and explain how that's all come about.
James Morrow, Patrick Carline, thank you both for your time. Let's get into the whole breaking issues just before we went to air coming out of Israel. Joining me now, the Australian's foreign editor, Greg Sheridan. Greg, we'll start, as I said, with that breaking news. This is about the origins, at least from the Israeli viewpoint, of the hospital attack in Gaza. There was a whole series of claims and counterclaims today for people at home who mightn't have picked it up. There was some terrible commentary from the Greens, of course. But then I saw this from the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, which just goes to underscore, wait until you have a confirmation from a trusted intelligence source before you speak, leader. But he didn't. Have a listen.
The news coming out of Gaza is horrific and absolutely unacceptable. International humanitarian and international law needs to be respected in this and in all cases. There are rules around wars, and it's not acceptable.
Is the hospital... the Israelis, Greg, say it was Islamic Jihad. They've put a lot of evidence on the table. What can you tell us?
Well, Peter, first of all, certainly it was a terrible tragedy. I don't believe there are any circumstances in which Israel would ever intentionally fire at a hospital. Nor do I think the Israelis are likely to be telling us lies. You know, the Americans, genuinely accidentally hit a Chinese embassy in Belgrade years ago, and they just confirmed it was them and it was a terrible accident, and they apologised profusely. I'm not yet willing, so I don't disbelieve the Israelis, but the evidence has just come out minutes ago. I don't yet think we really know what's happened. I absolutely underscore the wisdom of your remark in relation to Trudeau. Before we get too declamatory and definitive about all this, let's see the evidence. I don't disbelieve that Islamic Jihad may have misfired a rocket and so forth. But I just think everybody should wait and let's get all the evidence in and see. It's a terrible tragedy. A lot of innocent people have been killed. Palestinians can be innocent as well. But, I just think that the whole world should just stop and see what the actual truth is. And I don't disbelieve the Israelis, but I certainly want to sift all the evidence and see everything that we know.
Yeah, look, I think that is prudent, Greg. That's why you're the foreign editor. We want to go through sort of the blast patterns, intel. They've picked up some Arabic conversations on the ground. What were they saying at the time? All of that's going to come out. But I think it just underscores truth is the first casualty in war, they often say. And a lot of people were running around today in the federal parliament, as we saw overseas with Trudeau, I think talking out of their hat. And at this time, that's incredibly dangerous. Let's go to the Biden visit. Out of that Gaza attack today, of course, we had the Arab Council now postpone or indeed cancel their meeting with the US president. What's he going to, other than show support, what's he going to Israel for particularly given those remarks from the Iranian Supreme Leader that have just escalated things in recent hours?
So, Peter, this is a really complex sequence we're witnessing here. I've tried to analyse it in the paper without having any kind of super inside information. But I think this is an incredibly important visit by Biden, and I'd pay tribute to him for it. Look, I'm as critical of Biden as the next person. I find his press conferences excruciating and all the rest of it. But this visit takes some courage, even in Air Force One. It's not inconceivable. I mean, he's a super target. He's the #1 terrorist target in the world. He's certainly going there to express solidarity with Israel, and that's very good. That's a very good thing. No president has ever been on Israeli soil in the midst of an actual conflict going on. He's also going there to warn Iran. Now, I think Iran is threatening Israel, and I think it's bluffing. But it's all very well for me to think it's bluffing. Israel can't just assume that it's a bluff. But Biden has also moved 2 US aircraft carrier battle groups into the waters nearby. And those, you know better than me, Peter, those carrier battle groups, they've got lots and lots of surface ships with them. They got hundreds and hundreds of planes and thousands of missiles. They've got submarines, nuclear-powered submarines with them. So Iran would be on notice that if it attacks Israel, if it actually attacks Israel with missiles, it's overwhelmingly likely to get an American military response. That's very powerful. But having said all that, Biden will also be saying to Netanyahu, I want you to achieve your aims in Gaza at the minimum loss of innocent human life, and I want there to be some kind of humanitarian corridor, and I want there to be some provision of humanitarian aid to the civilians in Gaza. This is going to be a very difficult conversation. I don't think the Israelis are indifferent to those considerations in any event. But that's so without, Anthony Blinken didn't return my call and hasn't told me, but that would be my analysis of what they're doing now.
I want to ask you about Russia and China and how they play out here. Because, let's not forget we've got Ukraine going on as well. But why doesn't Egypt open its southern borders, at least to women and children?
Well, that's a very good question, Peter. Look, the Arabs are not really supporters of the Palestinian cause. The Arab leadership hates Hamas, and the Egyptian leadership particularly hates Hamas because Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood movement. And remember, al-Sisi came to power destroying the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the temporary brief rule of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt after Mubarak was overthrown. Also, they're not that generous to the Palestinians. It's absurd that Palestinians in the Arab world are sometimes still called refugees. They've lived in Arab countries for decades and sometimes for generations. On the other hand, it's not absolutely unreasonable that they don't suddenly want 2 million Palestinian refugees in northern Egypt. We sometimes forget Egypt itself is a pretty fragile state. It went through chaos and disorder at the end of Mubarak's rule. However, you're absolutely right, Peter. The Rafah crossing is going to be central to getting humanitarian assistance into the people of Gaza. Egypt has got a difficult situation, although it's not sympathetic to Hamas or anything. Suffering amongst the Palestinians does rile up its street, there's no doubt. That's what Hamas wants to do. And it can't be seen to be too cooperative with Israel. It's a great pity, though, that this strike on the hospital happened, whoever did it, and it torpedoed Biden's meeting, because I thought the symbolism of going to Israel, expressing solidarity, but then going to an American ally in the Arab world, Jordan, talking to another American ally in Egypt, and talking to the nearest thing to a legitimate representative the Palestinians have got, Mahmoud Abbas, to show American concern for the Arab world as well. I thought that was all pretty good. I'd score Biden pretty high on his response so far here, and it's a real pity that the Arab League has blown off this visit that Biden's making to the region.
You just mentioned the timing, and I think we both can say to our audience tonight there have been plenty of circumstances in the past where terrorists have, killed their own people. to stage something that looks like it's come from another adversary and tried to blame them in the public domain. Just quickly, China and Russia, anything there you can tell us?
Well, Peter, I would say to you the central strategic fact of our time is the de facto alliance between China, Russia, Iran and North Korea. So we've got a full-scale crisis in Europe with this brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Now we've got a full-scale crisis in the Middle East with Iran waging war on Israel through its proxies in Hamas and probably in Hezbollah. Now, America has never been more stretched in recent years, and Biden has not increased the defence budget nor increased the American industrial capacity, even though he's been spending trillions of dollars on net zero fantasies and the like. And I wonder if China, which, you know, they just hosted Vladimir Putin in Beijing, I wonder if China is not going to find this a propitious time to take some very aggressive action in the Indo-Pacific in about 6 or 8 weeks' time. I think that's a real possibility.
I tell you, it feels like the days of the axis of evil all over again. Greg Sheridan, thank you. All right, after the break, we're going to hear about corporate Australia and their reaction to the vote. I mean, are they going to take their medicine? Well, they're giving a lot of their staff trauma leave, if you can believe it. Plus, has the Victorian Liberal Party finally seen the light on Moira Deeming and the rights of women? Let's hope so. Coming up, the UK editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson. He's outstanding. We'll go through some things with him. Kel Richards too. Good words this week. But let's bring in my panel. There's a whole lot there as well. Shadow Minister for the Environment, Fisheries and Forestry, Senator John O'Donoghue. He's from Tasmania. And John Roscombe from the Institute of Public Affairs. Well, I'll tell you what, John, you at the IPA are always looking for the mood of the country. Read us the mood from Saturday night. What does the Voice say about Australia?
Thank you, Peter, for that question. But before I answer that, can I thank you for everything you have done to encourage debate, discussion, analysis about the most dramatic, radical constitutional change we've seen in our lifetime. You introduced many Australians to the wonderful, great leader that we have in Senator Jacinta Price. And since Saturday, I've had so many people say to me, thank you, Peter Credlin. So, Peter, what it means is that the overwhelming majority of Australians support the racial equality of all of us. They support the idea that Australia is still the best country in the world, that we reject radical change, and that we move forward together as one community, as one nation, as one people. Which is what Senator Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine have been talking about now for so long. So I think it's a success for the Australian way of life on Saturday.
Jono, people said, thank you for those lovely comments, John. People said, Jono, that Tasmania would go the way of the yes camp. You were pretty confident it would not. You were right. The PM now is rejecting an audit of the Aboriginal industry's spending. He's rejecting a Royal Commission into the abuse of children. But he sounds like he's pretty committed to his treaty, even though his voice failed.
Yeah, that is madness, Peter, that he wants to persist with this. And what John has said, and many others on this and other programs on this channel have said, voters never get it wrong, and they rejected this proposal he took to the Australian people last Saturday overwhelmingly. And so for the PM to reject some pretty basic propositions to understand exactly how the billions and billions of dollars that we are spending every year in this country to notionally support Indigenous communities to make sure it goes to where it needs to, rejecting that proposition but wanting to persist with a treaty, I think speaks volumes for the fact that this man is out of touch with the people he's supposed to lead. I hope he sees sense soon and abandons this course of action.
It's interesting, John. I mean, we've talked a lot about the politicians in this race, but of course there were the corporates overwhelmingly on the yes side. They've copped a hiding, so have all the woke sporting clubs. But I've seen a lot of emails, people have sent them to me, where their bosses are sending out on Monday and Tuesday an offer of trauma counselling or special leave. If you're at Melbourne Uni, of course, you can get special consideration, I think, for anyone who was on the yes side. But interestingly, at the universities, if you're a Jewish student perhaps traumatised by what you're seeing in Israel, you have to apply for your leave, but if you're someone traumatised by the voice going down, you get it anyway.
Well, that's right, Peter. And for me, there's two aspects to that. One is, of course, the appalling double standards, the hypocrisy of businesses, education institutions. If Yes had succeeded on Saturday, there'd be no special consideration for no voters. There'd be no leave for them. But there's something bigger than this. The intimidation, the bullying continues, Peter. What Melbourne University is effectively saying is that if you voted no on Saturday, if you believe all Australians are entitled to political and legal equality, regardless of their background, regardless of their race, then that view, which until a few years ago was accepted on all sides of politics, that view is now worthy of other people being counselled. That view is now worthy of people being put into a special category of consideration. That is bullying and intimidation, and it continues even after Saturday.
Jono, what I found interesting, and this is relating to rugby league and the jerseys the players wear, it wasn't so long ago that a few players who didn't want to wear a Pride jersey were roundly condemned, really vilified for having a religious stand on homosexuality and same-sex marriage. And then on the weekend we see a whole lot of players who wouldn't sing the Australian anthem because of the Voice decision, and everyone celebrates that.
Yeah, it's tolerance and inclusion if you agree with us. It's okay to do things if it's on the left, but if it's on the right, then it is the wrong thing to do. I mean, it is hypocritical, as has already been said. The fact that they celebrate someone standing there silently while our national anthem is being sung. That anthem is for all of us. It's not racist. It's not divisive, despite what some say. It represents this country and all of us. And the fact that there are some people who think it's a bold and brave thing to do to stand there silently, bringing shame on your country, as a matter of fact, when you do that, I think is outrageous. And I have to say, the double standards in the sporting sector, in the corporate world, those sorts of things are just ridiculous. I had someone give to me an example today just on that leave matter. One of those big accounting firms offering leave and counselling support to staff who were affected by the election of Donald Trump back when he won the US election. I mean, this sort of thing is ridiculous. And, the idea that people get upset by these things does not properly assess how resilient I think Australian people actually are.
Hey, just quickly, John, do I read this as a crack in the door or a bit of light coming in? Because it looks like the Victorian Liberal Party, this is the parliamentary party that expelled Moira Deeming, the parliamentary party, are looking like they're going to support her push for an inquiry into gender-affirming care for children. This is what we've seen happen in the UK. They've had such an inquiry. I think this is a good move, but does this mean Moira's coming back into the fold?
Well, I hope that it does. And in addition to the views of Moira being listened to in the parliamentary party of the Liberal Party, it's an indication, this decision from the Liberals here in Victoria, that maybe they're listening to parents. They're listening to the views of mainstream Australians. And if politicians listen to the views of mainstream Australians more often, we'd get better outcomes and there'd be a lot less out of touch, as we saw on Saturday.
All right, got to leave it there. Jono Dunningham, Senator Dunningham, and John Roscombe, thank you. All right, I might add too that there's big calls in Victoria for the Liberals to dump their support for Victorian treaty after the break. The future of conservatism throughout the West. It's a tough question. What is its future? We'll talk to an expert from the UK. Kel Richards too, coming up. Welcome back. We'll get into Kel Richards' words in a moment, but let's bring in a friend and warrior for centre-right values around the world. He is the editor of the outstanding Spectator magazine, the London version, the original and the best. His name is Fraser Nelson and he joins me out in the studio. I don't often have guests, so it's lovely to have you here. Hey, tomorrow night, you're on a speaking tour. Tomorrow night you're giving a speech to the Robert Menzies Institute. I declare I'm on the board of the Institute, so we're delighted to have you in Australia. You've got sort of 5 main themes you're touching on. The first is demographic change. And I thought that the experience of Europe on this issue is just really powerful.
Yeah, demographic change differs around the world, but in Europe, the speed of it in the last 20 years has taken everybody by surprise. After the Cold War, people thought, let's abolish borders, the EU has got freedom of travel, and nobody really moved around until it really picked up just after the turn of the millennium. Now you've got a situation where something like a third of Sweden are either immigrants or children of immigrants. So you end up with sort of two cultures in one society. But that can be a problem if you don't adapt the rules. Now, Sweden have got, for example, it's impossible to commit a criminal offence if you're less than 15 years old in Sweden. So you now end up with criminal gangs giving machine guns to 13, 14-year-olds, and they're running around committing huge crimes. So Sweden isn't changing its rules because they think, why should we? This is our society. So that is one example. In France, you've got big Muslim integration problems. In Italy, you've got the small boats, the migration issues, which you used to have in Australia, but now you don't. In Britain, I think we're a pretty good melting pot, actually. I think Britain, America and Australia are the great melting pots because we believe in sort of one cohesive culture. We don't really go in for multiculturalism. It's the multicultural aspect that can cause the tension. And Conservatives, I think, have struggled to get a narrative about this because you want to be a country where everybody was welcome, people blend in, people get along. But you do that by insisting on what binds us together rather than allowing divisive forces to tear apart.
And when we've previously argued for integration, we've allowed the left to frame that as assimilation, leave your culture behind, you have no culture once you come to our country. And of course, that's not what we're saying, but you've got to join the team, isn't it?
Exactly. If you're going to come to a country, you need to work out its norms and values and contribute towards it. And you can't really come there and be at war with that country. This is basic. I mean, most successful immigrant countries around the world, Australia is one of them, get that right. But the problem is that Conservatives can sometimes come across as being anti-immigrant or xenophobic or be accused of racism if they don't make the argument properly. Or if
they don't come the right way. I mean, a lot of these are economic migrants. They're not refugees in the UN definition sense, and that's also a challenge, isn't it?
It's a huge challenge, and this undermines support for immigration and asylum in general. So if people think the system is being unfair, you need to defend it. So in Britain, what we're trying to do is come up with an Australian system saying, let's deport illegal arrivals to Rwanda, because that will break the people traffickers. They're the enemy here, it's not the refugees. Now, that is hugely controversial, but I reckon it's the only solution longer term, because we're only going to get more people coming via people traffickers. And if you don't get on top of the situation, you're going to get a public backlash, and you're going to get xenophobia, and you're going to go down the road which Britain so far hasn't gone.
Net zero. I mean, I have to say, sadly, a centre-right government here under Scott Morrison drank the Kool-Aid and signed away our energy security for 30 years or 20 years down the track. It seems there's been a bit of a rethink in Europe coming out of the Ukraine energy crisis. Please tell me that's so.
Well, I think net zero peaked about 4 or 5 years ago as an agenda in Europe. You're now seeing big public backlashes against it, protests in the Netherlands, and politicians are beginning to work out that this bill, which they were slow to calculate, is now approaching. So if you're going to say you're going to ban, for example, all petrol cars by 2030, that's just a few years away, and people are thinking, hang on, I can't afford one of these EVs. So what Rishi Sunak is doing in Britain is just rowing it back just a bit, saying, hang on, let's do a cost-benefit analysis of this. Now, he's broken the omerta of net zero, that you never mention the costs, you never mention the trade-offs, you just talk in this hyperbolic language about the world's ending and we've got to act. When you actually subject it to rational analysis, will this make a difference to the overall picture? Do we want to tax the poor out of the sky and off the road? Can we make this more palatable? Then that changes the conversation. Now, Rishi Sunak and Claire Coutinho, his new energy minister, she talks about net zero zealots, people who are pushing it so far that they jeopardise the whole agenda because the public are not going to go along. They're not. So if you're a serious environmentalist, you want something that people are going to buy into. There's no point pushing an agenda that governments are going to be forced to jettison. So we're seeing a distance now between the sort of net zero zealots and the more realistic ones. And in Australia, I think you guys are a little bit behind the curve here, I hope you don't mind me saying.
I hope we catch up though.
But we can see the sort of modification of this. So we're seeing a kind of moderate centre ground emerging. People, of course, they care about the environment. They want to recycle, they want to reduce their carbon footprint. footprint, but they don't want to force people to spend in Britain £5,000, £10,000, £15,000 for a heat pump. But it is a common sense way of doing it, and this is now beginning to be introduced into an argument that had been quite kind of extremist and hyperbolic so far.
Okay, so that sort of thinking between the elites and the people that are impacted on the ground is where we were on Saturday night on this whole question of a voice in Australia. And one of the other touch points you've got is this rise of identity politics around the world.
Yes, now I think Australia is the first country in the world to have a referendum about identity politics. I don't think it was quite intended that way, but because the voice, there wasn't a specific notion, the only thing you had to debate was the principle. Do we believe we should be divided by race in the Constitution? And also, I think something amazing here happened. You had a leader emerge from almost nowhere, Jacinta Price, who had this vocabulary, this way of describing it, saying we're fighting for our values, this is about what unites us, say no to the voice of division. So all of a sudden, the Conservatives get what they're not used to having, which is a sort of a hero, a champion, somebody who can explain the basics, the ethics, the moral case for conservatism, the moral case for cohesion, and attacking as divisive the identity politics, which focuses, asks people to regard themselves as tribes and to have more in part. I mean, the thing is that, as Kemi Badenoch, our culture secretary, says in Britain, that she's from Nigeria, where there is tribalism as a problem there, and if you ask people to focus on what makes you similar to somebody thousands of miles away who looks like you, rather than your next door neighbour, it never ends well. Tribalism never ends well. And I think tribalism is being rejected in Australia. And in doing so, you found a cohesive narrative which has assembled a huge coalition of voters in Labour states, in Liberal states. We're now seeing a new electoral map, just like after Brexit. But Britain blew the chance after Brexit to make a political agenda out of this watershed. It'll be interesting to see if Australia now takes this chance.
Of course, your PM resigned when he lost Brexit. Ours, unfortunately, is digging in even harder. I've got to leave it here, and we didn't even get to freedom, lockdowns, and, of course, the issue of trans rights. But we'll get to that tomorrow night. Thanks, Fraser.
Thank you.
All right, if you want to go and see Fraser Nelson tomorrow night, the Robert Menzies Institute Gala Dinner is in Melbourne. Jump on the website, book a ticket. I think there's still tickets, not many left, though. As I said, I'm on the board, so I disclose that now. Coming up, Kel Richards after the break. Welcome back. President Biden, I'm just trying to think of his name, President Biden, I'm having a Biden moment, has landed in Tel Aviv, not off the aircraft yet. We've got some images there for you. We'll keep you posted tonight. Bringing in now Kel Richards, though much more important. Hey, Kel, some great words coming out of the weekend. This is a phrase, actually, silent majority. Give us that one.
OK, it goes back a long way. It goes back to 1815, would you believe? I wouldn't have expected that out of American politics in 1815. The Oxford says the silent majority is the mass of people usually overlooked because of their moderation. Isn't that interesting? Because of their moderation. The expression died for a long time and was revived in 1969 by Richard Nixon when he gave a speech 3rd of November 1969 on the Vietnam War, talking about the silent majority of my fellow Americans. And it has a second meaning. The silent majority also means the dead. Earlier generations, they are necessarily silent, and there are more of them than there are of us. And we listen to their voices when we listen to tradition. G.K. Chesterton said, tradition is the democracy of the dead. And that's an important silent majority we should not forget.
I like that. I like that. It reminds me of that definition of a conservative, someone who doesn't think they're morally superior to their grandparents. I like that one as well.
Yes, yep.
Hey, self-defence versus retaliation. There's nuance in that language, isn't there?
There is. In fact, there's an important distinction. Is Israel engaged in self-defence or retaliation? Retaliate comes from a Latin source word which meant to do to your enemy what your enemy's done to you. And the Oxford says the modern meaning of retaliation is the same. It's striking back in kind. Now, if Israel was doing that, they would be kidnapping Palestinians and holding them for hostage. They'd be beheading babies. They would be killing children in front of their parents. So what they're doing is not retaliation, it is self-defence. And the international law says self-defence is a government defending itself either in response to or anticipation of military attack. And that word anticipation means there's a strong element of prevention in self-defence. And that is what Israel is doing.
Well, something Hamas is doing and terror groups are doing this right around the world. I think it really took on another meaning with Islamic State. But propaganda, the war of information, where's propaganda come from?
Comes from a Latin source word, which is from where we get propagation and propagate, and basically to have children. And the idea of propaganda is you use disinformation, misinformation, to use the modern terms, to turn people into little copies of yourself, to get them all thinking exactly the same as you. Here you are, little mini-me's, think like me. That's what the word propaganda means, and it's one of the reasons why it is so dangerous. Peter, quickly before I go, you used a lovely expression, Biden moment. I'm going to write that up. You've created a new term, a Biden moment. That was wonderful. Well done.
I hope I didn't look as vacant as he often does on camera, but that will be for others to judge. Thank you, Kel, as always. See you next week. That's it for me. I'll be back tomorrow. Here's Andrew.